So today we're going to be talking about the Three Self movements. The Three Selves movement, or the Three Selves patriotic movement, is a government supervisory organ in China for state-sanctioned Protestantism, which is known as the Three Selves Church. Said church is under the supervision of the National Committee of the Three Selves Patriotic Movement of the Protestant Churches in China and the China Christian Council. I'm Kane Koa.
Tell us your major, Kane.
I major in kinesiology.
Okay,
My name is Jason Akai Vida, and I'm majoring in engineering right now.
great.
I'm Isaiah Gonzalez, and I'm a computer science major.
And I'm Elijah Chung. I'm a history and business marketing major.
All of you are great, but I just want to congratulate Elijah on being a major in history. So, everyone's welcoming us to this podcast series. We have a classroom full of students. All right. Okay, so let's start the first question.
Yeah, so the first question is, what was the origin of the Three Self movement, and how did it evolve? And also, how were other religions affected by similar movements?
That is a great question. So yes, thank you for asking that. Today we're diving into the story of the Three Selves Patriotic Movement, or TSPM for short. The roots of TSPM go back to a 19th century missionary named Henry Venn, who believed that churches in places like China and Korea should be independent from foreign control. He came up with the three selves. These comprise of self-governance, self-support, and self-propagation. Basically, this means churches should run themselves, fund themselves, and spread their message without relying on foreign missionaries. In Korea, these ideas really took off. Korean Christians embraced the three self principles, and over time, the Korean church became completely self-led and deeply embedded in Korean culture. This independence helped fuel massive Christian growth in the country, so much so that today, South Korea is on the larger sides of Christian populations in Asia. China, however, took a different path. After the May 4th Self movement in 1919, a major anti-imperialist and pro-Chinese culture movement, Christianity came under fire as a symbol of Western interference. This led to the anti-Christian movement in the 1920s, with missionaries being under attack, expelled, and even kidnapped by the KMT reign. Their absence forced Chinese Christians to set up and take over the leadership of churches and institutions, which in turn helped spread the Three Selves idea locally. After the Communist Party won the Civil War in 1949, the TSPM became official policy. A Christian leader named Wu Yaozong, along with others sympathetic to the communist cause, worked with the government to launch the movement. The goal was to rid Christianity of any foreign influence and align it with the political goals of the CPP. Other religions had similar setups, like the Buddhist Association of China and the Chinese Catholic Patriotic Association. This move was controversial. Churches were pressured to cut ties with their overseas partners and adopt patriotic names and messaging. Pastors were split. Some went along, others were imprisoned for refusing. Many churches were merged or closed, and Christianity started to look more like a political tool than a spiritual community. Then came the Cultural Revolution in 1966, when all churches were shut down and religion leaders were arrested or sent to labor camps. Things eased a bit after Mao's death in 1976. Under Deng Xiaoping in 1980s, religion came back to life, but only under strict government supervision. The TSPM was reinstated, but churches had to toe the party line. Faith was allowed, but only if it didn't challenge the state. Catholics had their own struggles. Instead of joining the TSPM, they were put under the Chinese Catholic Patriotic Association. A controversial 1918 deal between the Vatican and China gave the CCP a role in appointing bishops, something that deeply upset many Catholics, especially those in the underground churches who still recognize the Pope as their only spiritual authority. Meanwhile, other religions like Tibetan Buddhism and Islam still face heavy repression. In places like Xinjiang, Muslims are banned from openly practicing their faith, and children are forbidden from participating in religious activities. So, while the Three Self model helped build a strong independent church in Korea, in China it was re engineered into a tool of state control. One that still shapes how religion is monitored, regulated, and sometimes crushed in today's days.
So, Kanye, you mentioned the three selves. Can you repeat those? Self what, self what, self what, and self what?
Self governance, support, and propagation.
Right, and then you finally mentioned the whole idea of Catholicism
Mm-hmm.
vis-a-vis Protestantism. Wu Yaozong was a Protestant. Can anyone in the group, before we go to the next question, maybe say something about what is the complication, what would be the complications of having these three selves from the Catholic point of view? Because you hinted at that, Kanye, but
Yeah, I think if you're asking what I think, it's probably because like the Chinese government controls like who's leading the church.
right,
They're very
So
communist.
Right.
like they can put their views into the church
right.
and not like religious views.
So that's an important point. That would actually be a problem to some Protestants even. But a particular problem with Catholics and the Three Selves movement, a particularly large problem. And it's interesting because we're talking about this topic at a time when they're about to elect a new pope. So that's a hint. Which of the three selves would be most problematic from the Catholic point of view?
Self-governance,
Self-governance, right? Why?
because they decide everything.
Yeah.
Which happens.
Right, and the problem is in the Catholic world, who is the big governor of the activities?
Pope.
The Pope, and where does the Pope not live?
China.
He doesn't live in China, right? So this creates a massive problem from the Chinese point of view, right? Okay, next question.
Okay, so our next question is because of the general supervision by the government in TSPM, would you consider all churches under TSPM to be compromised? Isaiah.
That's a good question. I want to kind of break it into 5 points to kind of go over. I guess to kind of make your own decision. The first one would be criticism and distrust. So many house church pastors see the Three Self movement churches as compromised, serving the state rather than Christ, which is something you kind of mentioned earlier, that pretty much the government would have all control rather than the church having control of their own government. Sermons are censored, political themes are inserted, and the pastors are often limited in what they can preach. So, like you said, going back to what we said earlier about self-governance, is that these churches wouldn't be able to save their peace. I've had churches where I was back home that they would be kind of ridiculed because of certain beliefs they had that didn't align perfectly with everyone else believed. But through the Three Self movements, it would really cut down what you're allowed to say at church. And I think that's a problem for a lot of these churches because some of the stuff that's censored is directly what they believe and what they can say. My second point I want to mention is defense and nuance. Other Three Self movement churches are doing their best within harsh restrictions. So a lot of these churches that have converted to the Three Self movement, they're going to say, we're doing the best we can, what we can, so that we can still be legal, we can still be recognized by the government, and not be kind of having to be underground and hidden. So faithful believers and pastors continue to share the gospel under the Three Self movement legal framework. So like we said before, even though it's censored, they're going to try their best to kind of, I wouldn't say push the barrier, but try to push the line as much as they can without going over the line and upsetting the CCP. And then seen by some as a mission field rather than a corrupt institution. So we would say that some people see this Three Self movement almost like a challenge to kind of find a way to work around it without angering someone else, but rather how can we reach these people legally without, dabbing our toes in the wrong area. My next point I want to hit is the complex reality. So Karsten Valla notes that the Three Self movement is fragmented. Local leaders sometimes have autonomy and are even sympathetic to the house churches. And many young pastors are more open-minded and less tied to the old ideological training. So pretty much what I'm trying to say is that when you have the Three Self movement and you have new pastors come into power, new pastors come into these churches that grew up in the Three Self movement church rather than the old traditional church, they're more okay with the Three Self movement rather than kind of being against it, going against the grain, because that's how they were raised. You know, different people grow up in different places, and that's how they kind of end up the way they are. So if you grow up in the Three Self movement church, then you kind of are okay with the Three Self movement.
I would also kind of like to kind of jump in real quick. But despite the fact that the Three Selves, like the younger Three Selves movement church pastors are, I say, a bit more sympathetic, you also have that notion of where many of them did not grow up in the old times, where many people considered, at that time at least, that Christianity was an imperialist sort of like encroachment.
This is a good point.
Yeah. And thus, so for them, despite the fact, maybe they aren't as, I guess, as willing to go against the Three Selves movement, they're much more receptive to foreign pastors and foreign believers of beyond China.
Right. This makes me think of one big question, two questions really, or thoughts. One thing you just mentioned, Isaiah, is that there's this issue of the government speaking above the religious sensibilities, right? So, for example, one thing that the Communist Party often tries to persuade Christians to deny are, one, miracles, and two, what's the biggest miracle of all that Christians sort of adopt?
Raised from the dead.
Yeah, the resurrection, right? So here is this government that's basically saying to these Christian, churches, look, don't say anything about the resurrection, which is sort of like saying, if you're a Christian, maybe you just don't bring up Jesus, which is a complicated thing. And then, Elijah, you were bringing up this whole idea of, or you at least hinted at this idea of bristling under the Communist Party, right? So who are the people who don't obey the party, that are not the TSPM?
Well, basically any house church.
House churches, right?
Yeah.
So but they're also, what sort of agonizing reality do they live under?
Well, house churches, since they're not with the TSMP, they're legally not supposed to exist to begin with. So they're under constant, or well, maybe not under constant surveillance themselves, but they're always kind of looking for them, trying to see if they can root out any churches. And sometimes it's been mentioned that some of the Three Self movement pastors have actually collaborated with the CCP to kind of get rid of, though obviously it's like sometimes you can argue about, if this is an actual party, like you're trying to be what's the word? They're trying to be true to the party. They're trying to conform, or it's kind of a human nature, like out of jealousy. Maybe the house church leaders, the local one, is bringing in more believers than they are,
Right.
And so they want to try and bring in that fold.
Sadly, you bring up a really important point. Sadly, they're in competition, and this isn't what it's supposed to be like, right? Okay, next question.
The next question is, how does the CCP reconcile Christianity and other religions with communist ideology?
Oh yeah, just to mention, I don't think we've mentioned what CCP means. It's the Chinese Communist Party, and that their core problem was that communism is aesthetic by nature, and the religion is seen as a threat. As Chung was kind of stating, home churches got to stay in secrecy, and it's a threat to their state unity and ideological purity, and that Chinese Constitution guarantees freedom of belief, but only in practice within strict state limits, which also limits their belief and believing in Jesus and the resurrection. And just to go on from that, their strategy was to keep that very silent and secret, and the Chinese Communist Party seeks to synthesize religion, reshape it, and align it with Chinese culture and socialist values, and just totally reshape the religion of Christianity in general, and just encouraging, and this encourage united worship in a certain way.
Jason, you said something. You said the word very quickly, but it's a word that I want everyone listening to this podcast to hear, and that is to synesize. And synesize means what?
Well, yeah. You want to?
You-
Okay. Well, to synthesize, let's back up a little bit. We all know the term of like interculturation,
Right.
Where it's, well, for at least for Christianity, it's you're kind of bringing Christianity to them, but you're kind of bringing it to, or you're changing parts of Christianity so that it can blend into their culture easier. Syncretization is kind of is you could say in a more aggressive way of interculturation.
So I love this, right? The debate is, do you cut the tree of the culture? So if you go to a new country or a new culture, do you cut down their cultural tree, or do you graft Christianity on it? It sort of grows organically out of the culture that's already there, and that's syncretization. But the Communist Party, when it defines syncretization, it defines it what? As following the Communist Party. And that's a whole different way. That's a whole different way of approaching it. Yeah.
I think it's interesting that you said that, and then what Jason said earlier about them kind of changing the Bible. Like you said earlier, where they pretty much told these churches like don't mention the resurrection. I think from a biblical standpoint, a biblical opinion, if you pretty much say the resurrection didn't happen, it kind of almost invalidates the whole Bible itself.
Right.
So you telling people you can't preach about the resurrection is pretty much like you're pretty much pulling the heart out of the Bible.
Right.
Which is kind of interesting because they're like, oh, you can preach this, but you can't preach this, which kind of kills it.
Right.
In itself.
That's a really good point. At least the New Testament.
Yeah.
Right. Okay, let's move to the next question.
Got you, China. How is China affected by the Three Selves movement in today's society?
Okay, well, Christianity has very much evolved from when it first set foot into China a couple centuries ago. As you know, throughout the entire time, it was a very constant fight for Christianity to be able to be recognized as more than just a foreign religion, and also to be recognized as more than just a form of imperialism, at least for the Chinese. And in a sense, you could almost thank the CCP because by using this Three Self movement, it's the Christianity itself has been almost integrated more into Chinese society. It's now seen less as an invader and more of a, I don't know how to say it, but
Localized, maybe.
Localized. Yeah,
we need to have you say more about this. So how did Christianity become, in a way, independent? How did communism facilitate that?
Well, obviously, like Kaneko has said, when with the Communist Party wanting these Chinese churches to cut ties with the Western, it forced the Chinese Christians already there they found out that they kind of had to just deal with it and do it themselves. And also, like you said, in China, when it became communist, was much more enclosed and much more unwilling to spread out, which made the role of these leaders to it just made it much more important for them. So yeah. I think like they've also said, Three Selves movement is still considered the only legal form of Christianity, though, and despite the fact that there's been a lot of, I guess to say you could say this for a country that was talking about, we want to make Christianity or like religion in general die out. It's been a very, you could almost say it's almost been a little too quiet for what they've been claiming to do. Except for I think there was a period, I can't remember when, I think late 2010s, where there was definite, I think also around the time the Muslims, the Uyghur
right.
Muslims.
In Xinjiang, right.
Yeah, that was around the time they said, it was noted that there was a significantly higher pressure on both house churches and three self-movement churches as well.
Yeah. Isaiah.
I wanted to ask you, because you've been to China, I would assume maybe you've been to these three self-movement churches, but how would Easter be recognized in these three self-movement churches if they're not recognizing resurrection?
This is a good question. I think the important thing here is that they're not saying they can't talk about the resurrection. They're just recommending that they suppress that. And it is the case that they do, in fact, speak of the resurrection. So, 复活节, or resurrection, the Feast of Resurrection, as they call it, is still celebrated, right? It's still celebrated. But in recent years, the Bible has been read by the party, and the party has made very strong efforts to rewrite sections of the Bible. There's no way that neither Catholics nor Protestants will abide in that and that kind of practice. Well, here's my question for all four of you. So three selves: self-propagating, self-promoting, self-financing, and self-governing. If these are the three selves, how did missionaries? Just say something about how missionaries fit into this whole thing that we see as the three selves movement.
Well, again, the missionaries are based. They're the cornerstone. They're the ones who you can't have a church in a foreign land if you don't have someone there to to begin that process. So for them, the missionaries are, like I said, they're cornerstone. They're supposed to be the ones who start it, kind of like a farmer. They'll develop it and keep on growing it until, I think, well, at least this is what I feel like probably would have been an ideal sort of three selves church is after the missionaries realized, they look around, and it is good. They said, okay, looks like you guys can kind of handle yourself, and we'll take a step back from this sword. But of course, nothing's ever really perfect in the world, and it's much more complicated than just that.
And I think the point that you make, Elijah, that's key is stepping back. And by the mid-1950s, the missionaries are expelled. And once the missionaries are expelled, then who's left to run the Christian communities but the Christians themselves? And what was, I think, surprising to some of the missionaries was that, heck, they did it. They really did flourish, because what's curious is that if the number of Christians when missionaries essentially left was something like 4 million, 5 million, now if we trust some of the sources, upwards of 70 to 90 million Christians live in China. Most of that happens without missionaries there, right? So that, I think, is a really important point. Okay, well, any last remarks?
I would, I guess, a small remark about the. I don't think we really got to it, but we were talking about going back to kind of question 2 when we're talking about all the is it compromised? There was an author that I talked about briefly. Can't remember his exact name though right now at the top of my head, but he was actually my first true source about it, and he talked about how it's like how the the house church leaders they kind of hate the three selves movement. They're saying they're doing all this because they want to align with the communists, they want to be loyal, they want to be this, but then he kind of says it's a bit more complicated than that. He talks about how he talks about, I think I mentioned it briefly, the bitter melon, which talked about how all these three self movement leaders came to I think the 50th, 70, something around there, the anniversary for the three self movement, and they talked about it. And then you have that one of the head chairmen was like, you got to keep on instilling communist ideals, you got to keep on doing this. And he kind of talks about that, but he kind of briefly mentions something like that, but he says that it's a bit more than just like, look at that. Mm-hmm. They're clearly praising the communist parties. Like that must mean that they've been completely compromised. It's more as in, he says that it's more of you have to do. He believes it's more of a have to do it out of necessity.
Right. A survival
Yeah.
tactic. Yeah.
Mhm.
Right.
I think kind of bouncing off of that, it's kind of interesting how there's such a divide and mistrust between the house churches and the Three Self movement. But then when you look more into it, you find out that these Three Self movement church leaders are the ones that actually help find these house churches and kind of get them shut down and kind of caught, whether it's out of pressure, envy, national policy. It's just kind of interesting to me. It's like, as you're all Christians, you would almost want to have a common goal to move forward, but it seems like they just want to push their church rather than progressing together as a big group.
Yeah. This
And
is.
to, oh,
yeah.
my bad. I
Connie, no, go ahead.
I was gonna say that bring like a question to my head. Like, is that really like Christian if you're not centering Christ? Like, if everything you're doing isn't revolved around Christ, are you Christian or are you communist? Because you're following their ideals
Yeah.
and
Right.
not Christ's ideals.
Yeah. Yeah. This is a huge question that they ask in China.
Mm-hmm.
I think what they say in China is, guess what? We're all human,
Mm-hmm.
and by being human,
Yeah.
we behave in human ways that are
Mhm.
very frequently imperfect.
Yeah.
Right. So let's end here, but let me just end with a curious a historical event that happened. 1950s, the Communist Party takes over. They get rid of all the missionaries, and they tell the Catholics the Three Self movement means you have to be self-governing, self-propagating, and self-funding. So you have to figure out a way to govern yourself. The Catholics respond with, yeah, but we have a pope. So the government goes back, the Communist Party members go back, and they imagine this whole strategy. So they go back to the Chinese Catholics and they find a bishop and they ask the bishop, right, so you need a pope. That's what we understand about Catholics. And the bishop says, absolutely, we need a pope. So the party says to the bishop, well, we love this because we want you to be the pope of the Catholic Church of China. We want you to be the pope. And the bishop responds with, oh, yes, I love this. I just have a few requirements. One is that I have to be elected in a conclave in Rome. And two, I have to stay in Rome and live at the Vatican. If I get both of those things, I'm totally on board with your new paradigm. And then, interestingly, he went to prison for the rest of his life for that response. Well, that was very interesting. Very good job. And with that, we are finished with this series. So, thank you.